Good morning. Welcome. Thanks for coming to this particular session of IDEASpHERE. I'm Steve Walt, and the topic I want to explore today is why the United States doesn't seem to be that good at foreign policy anymore. I should say, by way of introduction, this is a work in progress. It's a book I'm working on, and so I'm expecting to learn a lot from all of your comments and disagreements and suggestions with what I have to say. It actually began with a talk I gave about a year and a half ago down at the State Department. I was invited to come in and give a speech at something they call their open forum, which is sort of open to the whole building on Friday afternoons. And because it's Friday afternoon, they said, please come in and be as provocative as possible. And I was willing to do that. So I said, why don't I come in and talk about why American foreign policy fails? And the State Department thought that was a sufficiently provocative topic. They were surprisingly receptive, and on the way back on the plane, I said, you know, there may be a book in this, and that's what I've been spending the year working on. So because it's early, the coffee may not have kicked in. I will also try to be provocative today. I just want to say at the outset that I'm going to be saying a variety of fairly critical things about different institutions and different individuals, but this is not personal. And in fact, I'm not suggesting there is some sort of vast capitalist conspiracy to ruin American foreign policy, or that the people who are doing it are not, for the most part, very well-intentioned, trying to do the best for the country and, in fact, for the world. I think the problems lie a little bit elsewhere. So let me start with the following comparison, just to suggest that it wasn't always this bad. Between 1945 and 1952, a rather small group of U.S. foreign policy officials created a lot of the key institutions that still underpin the global order: NATO, the World Bank, the United Nations, International Monetary Fund. They formulated and implemented the strategy of containment. They handled crises in a number of areas, and they did this while facing a geopolitical rival, the Soviet Union, that had a lot of military power and had the support and sympathy of millions of people around the world at that time. The record in that period was not perfect. They made mistakes, as everyone does, but it was a remarkably impressive run when you look back at it. Similarly, I would argue between 1988 and 1992, the first Bush administration, Bush 41, also did a remarkably good job overall, managing the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, the first Gulf War, the Madrid Peace Conference. Again, you could find things in their record to criticize, but I would argue it's a fairly impressive performance in unexpected circumstances. Now, by contrast, the record of American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, I think, is at best mixed and at worst a failure, even though the end of the Cold War left the United States on remarkably good terms with most of the world, in a really remarkable position. To use the words of Brent Scowcroft, who was National Security Advisor in 1992, we found ourselves perched at the pinnacle of power with the rarest opportunity to reshape the world. And yet, despite those advantages, here you want to focus on the right-hand column, we failed to secure a Middle East peace agreement despite multiple attempts. Clinton's strategy of dual containment in the Persian Gulf kept thousands of troops in the region. It was one of the main reasons Al-Qaeda ultimately decided to attack us, 9/11. We responded by invading Afghanistan and then Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and then failed to win a clear, decisive victory in either war, despite spending several $1 trillion on them. We failed to build a positive relationship with Russia over the last 20 years. We got blindsided, I would argue, by their response in Ukraine. I'm not defending it, but it appears to have been something of a surprise. Relations now worse than at any time since the Cold War. Our intervention in Libya a few years ago ended up creating a failed state there. Repeated interventions in Somalia beginning in the 1990s generally made things worse each time we've gone in. North Korea, India, and Pakistan all tested nuclear weapons in this period, despite strong American opposition. The United States, as you all know, has been at odds with Iran since 1979, but we've passed up several Iranian overtures to try and improve relations, and instead put enormous pressure on them to halt their nuclear program. But although we may get a deal at some point in the next year or two, It's worth remembering that Iran had 0 centrifuges operating in the year 2000, and it has 19,000 installed now and about 11,000 operating, suggesting that whatever we've been doing has not been working particularly well. We haven't completed a multilateral trade agreement since 1994. And the American response to the Arab Spring, I would argue, was haphazard at best. We helped push Mubarak out. Then a couple of years later, we welcomed the Egyptian military back in. We have an inconsistent response elsewhere. We've avoided a new quagmire in Syria, which I would argue is a good thing, but it's hard to look at our handling of Syria as particularly positive as well. And just one more thing, by most measures, the level of freedom in the world is actually lower now, and that includes things like press freedom, than it was 10 or 15 years ago. We got a big upward burst when the Soviet Union fell, but it's been going the wrong direction since then. Now, having said all that, there are clearly some successes. That's the left-hand column in that little chart. Dayton Accords, a better relationship with India, some of the nuclear security programs, including things that were pioneered here at the Belfer Center. But overall, I would say the record since '92 is not one that's going to win any prizes, and I would include Nobel Peace Prizes there too. At least doesn't necessarily deserve them. Now, what makes this a little bit surprising is that we have a foreign policy establishment now that is larger, more expensive, better funded, filled with knowledgeable people. We have hundreds of academics and policy analysts outside government to give public officials good advice on what to do. So you'd think we would be doing better with this much more elaborate, much better trained set of institutions, but I'm going to argue in a few minutes that that's actually part of the problem. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the American position in the world, because that's really the taproot of all of this, and then I want to talk about the institutions that make up the foreign policy community and what some of the pathologies of that community might be. I will then close with a dash of optimism and then a word of warning. And then I'll open this up because I'm very interested in what you have to say. The first thing to recognize here is that the Americans' geopolitical position is still remarkably favorable and remarkably unusual. We're still the world's largest, most sophisticated economy. We're the only country with global military capabilities. We still spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. We're separated from the other centers of power in the world by these 2 enormous oceans, granting further security. And we're further protected by the deterrent power of thousands of nuclear weapons. We have no serious enemies in the Western Hemisphere. It's worth remembering the continental United States has not been invaded since 1812. And that, by the way, was a war we started. So our history is very different than the history of the other major powers. Countries like France, Russia, Germany, China, Japan, even England lost about 50,000 lives at home during World War II. Now, this is a situation I think Americans should be very grateful for, but it also reveals an important paradox. Because the United States is so powerful and so intrinsically secure, it has the freedom to wander all over the world and intervene in various places. But at the same time, there aren't a lot of international issues where the outcome is going to have a decisive impact on American security. So we can get involved in various places, and if things go badly, as in Vietnam, as in Iraq, eventually the United States comes home and is basically fine. Right? That's an odd circumstance. No other country really has that luxury. This creates a number of challenges, I think, for U.S. foreign policy. It's a favorable position. It's something we should be grateful for. But first of all, when you're stronger and safer than anyone else, it's harder to set priorities, harder to set a clear strategy and stick to it. We have so many options, it's hard to decide which issues matter most. And different people can propose all sorts of ideas for what we ought to be doing with our capabilities, and it's hard to resolve them, hard to dismiss any of them. Having all those options means that U.S. presidents face constant pressure to do something whenever anything happens anywhere. Again, because we're the only country with a global military presence, divided into these regional combatant commands like CENTCOM and AfricaCom and Pacific Command, Whenever some crisis erupts, we usually have some forces nearby. We have a designated regional commander. Our credibility, in some sense, is automatically engaged. All you have to do is think of all the places John Kerry keeps flying to and all the problems he keeps juggling. Ukraine, Nigeria, South Sudan, Israel, Palestine, Iran, the Senkaku Islands. Right? At dinner last night, we had a long conversation about what the United States should be doing about the 200 girls that were kidnapped in Nigeria. No other country would be expected to have a response to that, have something to do. But of course, as you all know, when you try to do too much, you end up doing none of it particularly well. The bottom line here is because of our position in the world, the foreign policy agenda tends to be overcrowded. Now, at the same time, because we're so well off already, it's not worth spending a lot of blood or treasure on most of those problems. So one way to think about it is our foreign policy is both very ambitious but also slightly feckless. We try to do a lot, but we try to do it all as cheaply as possible. And let me give you just one comparison. The Marshall Plan in 1947 cost 5% of US GDP. It was a remarkable thing to have done because we really thought the future of Western Europe mattered enormously, and I think we were right. Had we tried to make a similar gesture in response to the Arab Spring, it would have cost $800 billion. And nobody was going to contemplate spending $800 billion trying to shape what was happening in Egypt or elsewhere. In fact, what we did was we offered Egypt about $1 billion in debt relief. Now, our fiscal position is a little bit different now than it was in 1947, but still, it suggests that there just aren't a lot of issues out there that it's worth spending a lot of effort on. And I would say, by the way, that Iraq and Afghanistan are not really exceptions to that because, of course, we didn't go into those conflicts thinking they were going to be as expensive as they turned out to be. One final thing is our position of primacy encourages other states, both friends and foes, to misbehave in different ways. Our primacy encourages adversaries to seek weapons of mass destruction, to join forces with one another to try and keep American power in check. So we often face more resistance than we anticipate. And our position of primacy also encourages allies to free ride so that the United States bears a disproportionate share of the global burden as well. Some allies, I think occasionally of Japan in the Senkakus in this regard, may be so confident of American protection that they will act recklessly and get us into trouble in other ways because we've done so much to reassure them. Now, just one final point here. If you go back to this list and look at the failure list, notice also that many of the items on this list of failures are basically cases of state building or social engineering, places where we've gotten involved in other societies to try and reshape their domestic institutions. And I think history tells us, plus a lot of social science, that this is very hard for anyone to do, let alone a country whose own history is very different and doesn't necessarily understand these countries very well. So one reason why our foreign policy has not been particularly successful is we've ended up tackling a series of challenges that are very, very hard and that we probably didn't know how to do in the first place. What all that suggests is that even if we had a really perfect system for conducting foreign policy, we would still face a lot of challenges today, given our, ironically, favorable position in the world. So unfortunately, I'm going to argue now that the system we have falls short of this ideal of perfection. It has its own problems. And let me talk now a little bit.
Just don't hit that button.
There we go. Let me talk a little bit about the foreign policy community, including, I'm sure, some of the people in this room. In a democracy, policy is not just determined by government officials, although they are obviously important. It's also shaped by lots of institutions in civil society. So you don't just want to look at government, although that's part of it. Let me outline what I would call the foreign policy community broadly defined. First, it's the formal institutions of government, obviously, state, Defense Department, Treasury, the intelligence agencies, Congress, the White House staff, sort of anyone in government who's connected to the foreign policy world. Second, you have a vast array of what I would call membership organizations. The World Affairs Council, some of you may belong. The Council on Foreign Relations, many of us belong to. Veterans of Foreign Wars. And these are all organizations that try to, in different ways, engage the American public, inform them about international affairs, encourage greater internationalism. Then there's, of course, think tanks. And there's 1,700 or so of these now in Washington. Brookings, AEI, Heritage, Carnegie are the big ones. Lots of smaller, specialized ones. And then we have, of course, because it's America, lots of interest groups and lobbies. The Arms Control Association, Human Rights Watch, defense contractors, ethnic lobbies, corporations, trade unions, all trying to shape what government officials do. The media, of course, is part of this. Anyone in the media who covers foreign affairs, who writes or opines about it, and I've listed a few obvious parts there. And then last but not least, academia, right? And including places like the Kennedy School. And if you just think of what many of my colleagues do, what Joe Nye and Graham and Nick Burns and Megan O'Sullivan, they teach students, they train the next generation, they also serve in government themselves, and they write books and articles that are designed to shape how we do things. Couple of things about this community. First of all, it's a community, and I mean that literally. It's a community where members know each other well, and where success depends on your reputation, on being well regarded, being respected within that community. Members of these institutions, again, know each other, and the old line, I think this is from Graham's book, Essence of Decision, to go along, you go along to get along. So also, members here often occupy many positions in the course of a career. Think of my friend Anne-Marie Slaughter, graduates from Harvard Law School, teaches at the University of Chicago, comes back to Harvard Law School, becomes dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, becomes head of policy planning at the State Department, and is now the president of the New America Foundation in Washington. An even better one is my friend Les Gelb, former president of the Council on Foreign Relations. His biography is like a perfect example of the foreign policy world. He gets his PhD here at Harvard. He teaches briefly at Wesleyan University. Then he becomes a Senate aide. Then he goes to the Pentagon. Then he goes to the State Department. Then he becomes national security correspondent for the New York Times. Then to the Carnegie Endowment, and eventually becomes president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I could multiply examples like that. That's a very familiar foreign policy career. Some people in the community hold multiple positions at the same time. Our colleague here, David Sanger, national security reporter for the New York Times, and he co-teaches a class on American foreign policy with Graham Allison. Then there are the so-called power couples in Washington. Two examples, Peter Baker of the New York Times and Susan Glasser, who's the editor of Politico magazine, used to be at Foreign Policy magazine. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs, who's married to Robert Kagan, who's a prominent foreign policy intellectual at Carnegie. Right. Because this is a community, right, professional success depends, again, on having a positive reputation, and that means staying within a certain consensus view on foreign policy. And despite all the partisan wrangling that you see in DC, there's, I think, remarkable agreement about the fundamentals of American foreign policy within that community. Most people in it, to simplify just a little, I would characterize as either sort of neoconservatives on the one hand or liberal internationalists on the other. And there's really not that much difference between these two groups. They're committed to American global leadership, to using American power to shape what other countries do. They tend to see the United States as a consistently positive force in world affairs. And I often describe this as saying that Democrats will use the phrase that we're the indispensable nation, and Republicans tend to prefer the phrase that we're an exceptional nation, but they essentially mean the same thing by it. And this basically means that the United States has both the right and the responsibility to manage as much of world politics as it can and to encourage positive change in as many places as possible, spreading democracy, weakening enemies, stopping proliferation, advancing human rights, and pulling as many states as possible into the US orbit. I don't know if you can read this or not, but I have a couple of quotations here. One is by Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. It says, "The basic goal of American foreign policy is to integrate other countries into arrangements consistent with U.S. interests." Or to quote Donald Rumsfeld, "To be so powerful and forward-looking, it's clear to others they ought not to pose threats or dangers to us." What I mean by this is the consensus view is we're not a status quo power. We are not simply a country that wants to keep things exactly as they are. We are a country that wants to try and shape the evolution of world politics in a variety of ways. And when I talk about a consensus, one nice illustration of that is that almost all members of Congress and almost all of the senior members of the Obama administration in his first term, with the exception of Obama himself, supported the invasion of Iraq in 2003, suggesting that there is a real consensus there. Now, just as the last line here is important, if you think about most parts of the foreign policy community, there's both an imbalance of power between the United States and the rest of the world, but there's also an imbalance of power between organizations that favor a lot of global activism, the United States being actively engaged in lots of parts of the world, and those that might be favoring a little bit more restraint. So I would argue that the American military, for example, is not particularly hawkish, not particularly interested in intervention all over, but it does tend to define American interests broadly and sees the world as filled with dangers that we have to be ready to address, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Organizations like the Council, the World Affairs Councils, most think tanks actively support U.S. leadership. Most of them, or many of them, were created, in fact, to convince Americans to be more actively involved in the world. And these different organizations don't agree on every single policy issue, but they all tend to lean towards greater U.S. involvement in the world rather than less U.S. involvement in the world. And of course, then there's all these various interest groups and lobbies who are generally trying to get the United States to do something somewhere on behalf of someone. There are, by contrast, surprisingly few groups who I would argue consistently favor a more restrained U.S. posture. The one I can think of is the Cato Institute, which is sort of the libertarian organization in Washington. It's really only the only prominent think tank in Washington that wants the United States to have a smaller footprint in the world. But if you put all that together, you have a powerful tendency for the U.S. to get overcommitted because most groups, most individuals, most organizations in our foreign policy world favor greater involvement rather than less. And if each group gets some of what it wants, there's a sort of a log roll going on, the United States ends up being very, very busy. And again, that really shouldn't surprise us, and it's not even clear how much it should bother us, because, of course, people get interested in foreign policy because they want to do something to make the world a better place. Nobody seeks a position in Washington in order to do nothing. It's because they actually want to do something positive. But notice also that global activism is also in their self-interest. The more ambitious American foreign policy is, the more influence, power, and money these people and these organizations are likely to get. And by the way, that's especially true of the private sector companies that are increasingly involved in different aspects of foreign policy. Finally, this community I've been describing is more supportive of global activism than the American people at large. Now, on the one hand, polls show that there is consistent public support for a shared leadership role. And this goes back decades. And it's been over 70% in polls going back to the 50s. That if you ask, should the United States be one of the world's leading countries, American people support that very strongly, and that's held quite steady. But on the other hand, in 2006, 60% of Americans reported they felt the United States was doing more than its share in the world. In 2009, 50% of Council on Foreign Relations members favored increasing U.S. troop levels in Afghanistan. Only 32% of the general public supported that. Again, suggesting there's a gap between the foreign policy elite or community and the American people. In 2013, 52% of Americans agree that with the statement, the United States should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along as best they can. It's the highest number that has reached ever. It's been asked back to the 60s. First time I think it got a majority was in 2013. Also 2013, 51% of Americans think the United States does too much. 17% say we do too little. Again, just to show the gap, Council on Foreign Relations members, not surprisingly, those numbers are reversed. 21% say it's too much. 41% say it's too little. Again, suggesting there's a gap here between, again, what the foreign policy elite thinks and what the people think. And then finally, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? We should not think so much in international terms, but concentrate on our own national problems and building up strength here at home. In 1964, 54% of the American people agreed with that. By 2013, 80% of the American people agree with it. What I'm suggesting here is there's a little bit of a gap between what the foreign policy community wants. And by the way, that doesn't mean that the American people are right necessarily, just that there's a difference here. So the question is, how does the foreign policy community convince the rest of the country to support a pretty active international agenda? Let me just suggest what some of that is. I think the main technique for doing this is threat inflation. The first tactic is to exaggerate the level of global dangers because that's the only way to convince Americans that they have to be really actively involved in every corner of the world. Dean Acheson famously said, advocacy must be clearer than the truth. And when Harry Truman was about to go in and give the speech announcing the Truman Doctrine, Acheson said to go in and scare the hell out of the American people. That was his advice. And by the way, it was, in that case, pretty good advice because the speech was successful. So as I've already described, the United States is, in fact, a very secure power. Yet ever since World War II, we've tended to depict even relatively minor threats in the most god-awful terms. I've got a few examples up there. The McCarthy period, American leaders genuinely believed that communists were infiltrating lots of key institutions in the United States. During Vietnam, American leaders genuinely worried that failure in Vietnam would lead to falling dominoes. As it turned out, of course, it was the Soviet Union that collapsed 14 years later. We have worried in recent years about, or in past years, about bomber gaps and missile gaps and things like that. And today we tend to portray even minor power rivals who are problems, like Iraq under Saddam or Iran today, as if they are the most god-awful threats out there. Just as a reminder, Iran's defense budget is less than $15 billion a year. Ours is still in excess of $500 billion, suggesting that Iran, although a problem, is not necessarily a grand threat on the scale we've continued. We continue to obsess, even today, about international terrorism, but I would argue that the real terrorist danger, leaving aside the nuclear terrorism question that we study a lot here, is actually quite small. If you calculate the odds that you're going to be hurt in a terrorist incident here in the United States, each year it's about 1 in 3.5 million. You are more likely to be harmed falling in your bathroom than you are to be hurt in a terrorist incident, yet we are spending billions of dollars every year and intervening in many parts of the world to try and deal with that problem. Now, I'm not suggesting that these problems aren't worth studying and aren't worth trying to deal with. I'm suggesting we have a powerfully rooted tendency to exaggerate dangers because the country is, in fact, pretty secure, and the only way to persuade the American people to support a very ambitious foreign policy is to mobilize it by scaring them in a variety of ways. My concern is if the public is constantly being told about looming dangers in far-flung corners of the world, they will tend to go along with policies, whether it's preventive war, targeted killings, expanded domestic surveillance, things like that, even if those problems sometimes make the problem actually worse. All right, a second way that we get into trouble in foreign policy is if the marketplace of ideas doesn't work. In theory, democracies ought to be better at many aspects of public policy because we can debate alternatives and we can weed out bad policies by having open discussion and open debate. And I think that is generally true But it doesn't work as well in the realm of foreign policy for a couple of different reasons. Here, in foreign policy in particular, government officials have lots of ways to manipulate information. They can classify information that they don't want the public to know about. They can prosecute whistleblowers and journalists who publish their work. They can leak information selectively in order to build support for particular policies. And that's different than what happens in domestic affairs. Here at home, ordinary citizens have independent ways of verifying if policy is working well or not. So if the roads are crumbling or you've just lost your job because the economy is tanking, ordinary citizens can see this for themselves and draw the right conclusions. But what the public knows about Al-Qaeda, the situation in Afghanistan, Iran's nuclear program, the fine details of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement comes mostly from government officials and from the media themselves. So it comes straight from the foreign policy community that I've already described. It's much harder for ordinary citizens to have independent ways of evaluating how we're doing. And I think that's magnified if there is a sort of tight, maybe even incestuous relationship between media and government. Again, if they're all kind of part of the same community, and if journalists often depend on access to government officials, there's going to be a tendency, at least in some cases, I think, to soften coverage or be less vigilant than you might otherwise want. Just a couple of examples of this. So before the Iraq War, it is now widely understood, both the New York Times and the Washington Post were fed false information by the Bush administration, which they published uncritically. What's interesting, of course, is that hardly anybody paid much of a price for doing that. Back in 2008, it was revealed that the Pentagon press office was giving retired generals VIP tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. And when they would come back from these VIP tours, then the Pentagon press office would essentially shop these retired officers to various media outlets. So they would appear on television and talk about how things were going, and of course give a very upbeat portrayal about how the war was doing. This, of course, meant that the American people got a somewhat distorted view of how both of these campaigns were proceeding. Finally, there are at least some areas where I think we don't have a particularly lively debate, and let me give you three examples. Consider the end of the Cold War itself. This was a seismic event in world affairs. Our major adversary had just imploded. You might have thought something that momentous would then have sparked a very far-reaching debate about America's role in the world. How that debate might have turned out, I don't know. But it didn't. There was hardly any discussion, right, about whether the United States needed to maintain the same network of alliances, whether it should expand them, as it ultimately did. And anyone who suggested that maybe this was the time for the United States to rethink its global posture was quickly labeled an isolationist and largely ignored. So this debate simply never happened. Until very recently, I think it's been very difficult to have a serious debate on many aspects of U.S. Middle East policy, particularly our relationship with Israel, also our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And I would argue that we've had a less effective policy that's also been less effective for Israel as well, and we would have been better off if we could have had a more open discussion on that issue. And then finally, the debate on Iran, again, until very recently, even people who are strongly in favor of diplomacy towards Iran and think that's the way to solve this almost always add at the end of the discussion, but of course, all tools or all options have to be on the table, including the threat of military force. That's the sort of standard formulation, even among relative moderates, right? People who suggest that maybe threatening Iran constantly with military force is a bad way to persuade them not to get a nuclear weapon have largely, not entirely, but largely been excluded from that debate, again, until very recently. My point, by the way, is not that the consensus view is necessarily wrong. That's a separate question. It's just that the debate on these topics and some others is much narrower than would be optimal. A third problem in this community is what I'd call the sort of lack of accountability, or at least minimal accountability. And this is a tricky issue that I'm still thinking my way through. For starters, consider that no high-level military or civilian officials were held accountable for the failures at Abu Ghraib prison. The convictions were all of low-level enlisted personnel. President Obama has not held anyone accountable for U.S. use of torture in the Bush administration, even though it was arguably a violation of U.S. and international law. The CIA has gone to great lengths to keep reports on those activities out of the public eye. Second set of examples, you all know F. Scott Fitzgerald's line that there are no second chances in American life. In fact, there are infinite second chances in the foreign policy world. I'll give you 3 examples. A woman named Elizabeth Obeji was an analyst at a think tank in Washington, did a lot of reporting on Syria, a lot of testifying, appeared on television a lot. She was forced to resign from her position when it was discovered that she'd falsified her resume. She'd claimed to have a PhD. She hadn't even been to graduate school. 2 weeks after she resigned from the think tank, she was hired as a foreign policy aide by Senator John McCain. Second example, Elliott Abrams. You all know him. He was convicted of lying to Congress in the Reagan administration, pardoned by the first President Bush, rehired by the second President Bush, where he worked as a White House aide. One of the things he did as a White House aide was to foment a civil war between Fatah and Hamas in Gaza. Unfortunately, Hamas won, so that didn't work out particularly well. Despite what I would argue was a relatively unsuccessful career, he was then, when he left government, appointed as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Lastly, consider James Clapper, current director of Central Intelligence, who told Congress that the National Security Agency was not spying on Americans. When this lie was revealed, he apologized, admitted that he'd misspoke or had not told the truth. Lying to Congress is a felony, but Clapper still has his job. Now, meanwhile, whose careers suffer? Well, in some cases, it's the people who get it right. And my poster child for this is Colonel Paul Yingling, who served several tours in Iraq. Right? And he wrote an article in an Army journal criticizing the senior leadership of the Army, right, for how they were handling the Iraq War. And the article was, by the way, very well received. People thought he'd done a fine job of diagnosing the leadership problems in the Iraq campaign. But you know the answer to this question. Did he rise in the Army? No, he's now teaching high school in Northern Virginia. And that's not a bad thing. I'm sure he's an excellent instructor, but it would be better if the people who spoke the truth got recognized and rewarded for it. It is also worth noting that the most common reason that American military commanders are relieved is sexual misconduct, not poor performance on the battlefield, but we haven't really been winning the wars we've been waging in various places. So that suggests they're either not leading as well as they could be, or that they're not telling civilian leaders what they need to hear before we get involved. Now, let me give you just 2 other examples of this problem. So this is parts of an ad that appeared in the New York Times. It was a paid advertisement that was put there by 33 scholars of international affairs. I notice it's in 2002, before the war started, and the headline was, "War with Iraq is not in the U.S. national interest," and the ad proceeded to lay out why that was the case. There's some interesting names there. Tom Schelling is in the upper right, and some others. No real pacifists here, by the way. No real left-wingers. So the question is, what do these 33 scholars have in common? Well, 1, they were right. And 2, none of them have served in government or been affiliated with a major political campaign since this ad was published. Now, some of them are too old, probably wouldn't have. Several are actually no longer with us, but still, it's at least interesting. In short, despite all the partisanship you hear about in DC and the bitter fights over things like Benghazi, the foreign policy world is in some ways a self-protecting community. And I just want to give one other example of this. This was reported in Elizabeth Warren's new book. She went to see Larry Summers to get his advice on how to be effective in Washington, and this is what he told her. Teed it up this way: I had a choice. I could be an insider or I could be an outsider. Outsiders can say whatever they want. People on the inside don't listen to them. Insiders get lots of access and a chance to push their ideas. People, powerful people, listen to what they have to say. But insiders also understand one unbreakable rule. They don't criticize other insiders. Now, I think Larry's right here. I think he was actually also giving her good advice. But the question we want to ask is this a healthy situation? If the people who get things wrong pay little price for it, just get reappointed when the political winds shift, and the people who get things wrong get reappointed, and the people who get things right don't get recognized, then why would we expect to do better over time? I just want to add one other caveat to what I've just laid out here. Although I think accountability is very important, we do want to hold people accountable. We can't demand perfection either, right? Because no one's perfect. Every politician's going to make mistakes. Every foreign policy person is going to be making mistakes at times, and we don't want to make people so risk-averse, right, that one mistake ends your career. So thinking through exactly how tough we should be, I think, is a trickier problem than perhaps I've suggested. On the whole, I think our system is now laxer than it ought to be, but still, I think that's a tricky issue. All right, one final thing. In order to support large global engagement, do lots of things, you have to keep the costs low. Bill Clinton did this by not sending ground troops anywhere dangerous. George Bush failed because he mistakenly thought Afghanistan and Iraq would be inexpensive, could be done cheaply. Barack Obama did send some more troops to Afghanistan, but he put a strict time limit on it, has relied much more on special forces and drones. The all-volunteer force is critical here as well. The people who are suffering in the conflicts we've been involved in are volunteers. They generally are not the sons and daughters of the people who are sending them there. And we also try to minimize knowledge of what we're actually doing in other places, what the costs of foreign policy are to other populations. And I think secrecy helps here too. 2 weeks ago, the Senate removed a clause from an intelligence bill that would have required the president to report on the number of people killed in American drone strikes or in targeted killing operations in other countries. Last year, the former deputy chief of mission in Yemen estimated, quote, the United States generates roughly 40 to 60 new enemies for each al-Qaeda operative killed by drones, right? Now, that estimate might be wrong, right? But my point is that we can't really judge whether something like the drone campaign is cost effective if we don't have access to the information of what we're actually doing. I should emphasize, I think trying to keep the costs low is a good thing. The problem is if you get involved in lots of places all the time, sometimes you're going to do some things and the cost will be bigger than you think. All right, I'm almost done. One final question is just to ask how the bureaucracy itself works, and I can't go into detail on this, but I'll say a few things about it. First of all, each president gets to appoint about 3,000 people, 3,000 presidential appointees. 800 of them require Senate confirmation. This means tremendous turnover whenever the White House changes hands. It goes fairly deep, right? Not just the cabinet level, but into assistant secretaries and things like that. It's as if Apple, GE, Boeing, Goldman Sachs was replacing its entire upper management team every 4 years or so. Now, politics is different, but no other great power operates this way, has the same level of turnover on such a regular basis. But at the same time, the confirmation process in Washington has gone completely off the rails, which means there are lots of positions that are left unfilled for months after a new president comes in, which would not be a problem if we weren't trying to run such an ambitious foreign policy. This means that the permanent foreign affairs bureaucracy is really in charge, not necessarily the people we appoint, and therefore the same policies are likely to persist over time, right? Particularly when a lot of the presidential appointees only stay in their jobs for a couple of years, particularly if they're drawn, say, from academia. More interestingly, we're also the only major power that routinely allows amateurs to serve as diplomats. 30% of US ambassadors are campaign contributors of one form or another. And some of them, having met a number of them, some of them I think probably do an excellent job. But in general, I think this is a bad practice. Today, 16 of the 28 US ambassadors to NATO countries are campaign contributors, not trained diplomats, not professionals. And think of this in the context of the Ukraine dispute. All right? Germany is a critical country in terms of formulating an intelligent response to what's happening in Ukraine. We need to have Germany sort of with us on this particular issue. The Russian ambassador to Germany, Vladimir Grinin, has 17 years of service as a diplomat in Germany. He speaks fluent English, he speaks fluent German. The US ambassador, John Emerson, was an entertainment lawyer in Los Angeles. He raised $3 million for President Obama's 2 political campaigns. He has no prior diplomatic experience. He's now got 8 months. He speaks no German. Now, again, he may be doing a fine job there, but it's hard to believe he's in a better position to persuade the German government to see things our way. One final thing, we have this other odd feature that we have a 4-year presidential term and we have essentially a 1-year election campaign to select the next president. No other democracy has as long an election campaign as we do, which means we're essentially distracted by domestic affairs for 25% of every president's term. So if you put all those things together, the real question is not why American foreign policy fails, it's rather why it ever succeeds. And that gets back to my very first point, which is that we're in such good shape overall, geopolitically, it may not matter. This is the optimistic part. Does this really matter? China is likely to face serious headwinds in the years ahead while they deal with their own economic problems, environmental issues. They've got problems with most of their neighbors, lots of corruption, an aging population. So it's not going to be an easy couple of decades for China. The EU is still mired in economic doldrums. Its population is shrinking and aging. The Middle East likely to face protracted instability for many years as the implications of the Arab Spring keep playing themselves out. It's not going to get settled. India, Brazil, and Turkey, these countries that we all thought were taking off in various ways, all facing, in my view, significant economic and domestic political challenges. Meanwhile, back here in the United States, our economy recovering not as fast as we would like, but faster than any other industrial power. The shale gas revolution could bring us energy independence, a manufacturing boom, improved trade deficit. Bottom line, if you take the long view and you're thinking in terms of the global balance of power, the United States should actually be in very good shape, provided we don't make too many costly mistakes, which merely goes to confirm Bismarck's famous line that there appears to be a special providence that looks after drunkards, fools, and the United States of America. And of course, we should all hope that that's true, at least if you're an American, but we should also heed Pogo's warning, right? That the only thing we have to fear is ourselves. That in fact, given how favorable our position really is, it's self-inflicted wounds that are the main problem. I remain concerned that the foreign policy system we currently have is a little bit too likely to make them than I would like, often doing so, by the way, with the best of intentions. Well, I hope that is sufficiently caffeinated to start your day, and let me stop here and look forward to hearing your comments, questions, or violent disagreements. Thank you very much. Now, the first hand I saw was right there.
I understand what you're saying about the foreign policy community, but what I'm wondering about is whether that's anything new. We talked about the wise men, we talked about the best and the brightest during periods when you were saying that our foreign policy was working. So I guess my question is it really other issues or other things that are happening in the world that are leading to our more recent failures?
I would say it's a combination of things. I mean, first of all, the nature of the foreign policy community has changed in at least 2 fundamental ways. One, it's much bigger than it used to be, just far more people. I think we have something like 855,000 Americans with top secret clearances now. right? And if you compare that to the size of the foreign policy establishment in the Truman administration, when the policy planning staff was 5 people, George Kennan and 4 friends, basically, we had a much smaller, nimbler operation, and virtually anybody who has gone to Washington and come back here always says they had not realized how hard it was to get anything done, right? We were talking earlier before the lecture about how it's rowing through molasses, and that's a change. The second thing that I think has happened is the end of the Cold War. That when we were facing the Soviet Union, it did impose a certain structure, a certain discipline on American foreign policy thinking, and it allowed presidents to rule out certain things as being crazy, risky, too costly. So the thought experiment would be, imagine someone had said in 1981, I've got a great idea. This Saddam Hussein fellow is really bad news. Let's invade the country and overthrow him. Okay? This would not have gotten traction for more than 30 seconds because someone would have said, I'm sorry, we have a Cold War to wage here. Iraq is a Soviet ally. The Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. This looks like a really dumb idea. Once we are in the post-Cold War world with no peer competitors, no serious rivals, right, it looks like we can do almost anything at relatively low risk, and therefore the worst tendencies of the foreign policy community can come out in various ways. So I think it's worse now, but it's in part worse because our position in the world is in some respects better. Sir?
Can you talk about what role history should play in our U.S. policy? I guess what I'm struck by is you have your foreign policy community, there are no historians, that you read the resumes of a couple of people, no one has a history. I'm not a historian either, no one is a historian. That we obviously have our own history, other countries have their history, they have their history with us. And I just think that we don't pay any heed to history, and it's very important, and I'm curious as to how important you think that is.
I actually wrote something on this a couple of months ago. 2 years ago, when Henry Kissinger returned to Harvard for the first time in many years, he gave a presentation over in Memorial Hall in Sanders Theater, and he was asked at one point what he thought the best preparation for a career in foreign affairs would be, or in diplomacy would be. And he said that training in philosophy and history. Now, notice that's what he studied. So there was a little bit of biography there. But he then said that philosophy, because it taught you rigorous thinking. It taught you how to think in a rigorous, logical fashion. And history, because it provided you with a sense of both humanity's possibilities, all the things that could happen in various places, but also pitfalls, right? And I thought, I remember hearing this and thinking he was exactly right. I think that training in history is of immense importance. And just again, think of the current agenda. You cannot make sense out of what is happening in Ukraine if you don't have not just a sense of recent history, what's happened with NATO expansion, Putin's reactions to that. So you want to know some recent history, but knowing Ukraine's relationship to the Soviet Union, and even some of the cultural cleavages inside Ukraine, which go back centuries. All of them manifest themselves in this. So if I were sitting at the State Department trying to wrestle with Ukraine, understanding that history would be absolutely essential. I would say the same thing about many of the disputes that are now taking place in Asia, the territorial disputes. And finally, and I think this was implicit in your question, the other thing that is absolutely essential is when you're dealing with other countries, is to understand that their understanding of history will not be the same as ours, which is not to say theirs is right and ours is wrong, but if you're trying to persuade them to see things your way, having some understanding about how they look at past events. To take the obvious example, you couldn't deal with if you had no knowledge of the relationship between the United States and Latin America, your understanding of how some Latin Americans see the United States would be, I think, deeply impoverished.
My question, but we don't do that, and why don't we do that?
Well, we are trying to fix this. We are attempting to hire, I'm hoping, a couple of historians here. I mean, for many years we had a historian, Ernie May, quite distinguished.
I meant we, the U.S. government, not
We,
the city.
okay.
Sorry.
Well, we, the Kennedy School, are trying to fix this, and first us, and then the U.S. government. I should add one other point. I don't know if Ash Carter said this, but Ash, who's been number 2 at the Pentagon, when he was a member of the faculty here, was one of the most eloquent advocates of precisely this position, that in government, particularly in international affairs, the use of historical analogy, the use of historical arguments, almost the rhetoric of history is essential, and it's a central part of all policy discussions, and we ought to be training more of our students in how to do that in a sophisticated way.
Oh,
Sure, and then this gentleman right here, and then we'll...
He's got the mic.
Oh, he's got the mic, then we'll come back. Go ahead.
This follows up on the question that was just asked, and I wanted to address what I think are the 2 largest foreign policy entanglements in the past 60 years, Vietnam and Iraq. And when I look at how those were handled by the foreign policy establishment, and I want to make a statement and then get your reaction to it, I guess is what I'm trying to do here. It strikes me that in both of those situations, American policymakers did not understand the local culture or the nature of the conflict. So in Vietnam, just to pick one misunderstanding, they didn't understand it was basically a nationalistic movement, and the Vietnamese, whether it was French or US, it wasn't a communist expansion. In Iraq, I think that we did not understand that when you pull the plug at the top with Saddam Hussein, all the cultural and religious strife you would be causing and what that would imply. I think that in both situations, I'm not sure that either president got differing views in a very substantive way. He didn't have a whole group of folks in who understood the cultures, understood the impact, and really listened to them. And incidentally, both of the presidents, Johnson and Bush, did not have much foreign policy experience. Fourthly, I think neither of them, or neither of our foreign policy establishments at the time, or military establishments, adhered to clear missions, clear exit strategies. We, in both cases, got into trying to rebuild the country, which wasn't originally there. Fifthly, I think there's a tendency to listen to military leaders too much, whether it was Westmoreland in Iraq or the Rumsfeld doctrine with his folks. And then finally, there wasn't really the kind of international support you'd expect in an involvement like that. So I guess I'm just making the statement to say that it seems that these themes are running through a lot of our foreign policy when we go abroad, as opposed to something like Desert Storm, where the first President Bush, who had lots of foreign policy experience, did the opposite. There was a clear mission. It was clearly in our national interest to do it, and so forth. So I'll stop.
It probably won't surprise you to say that I agree with most of what you said. I differ a little bit, actually, on the Vietnam case. I mean, your summary of Vietnam is, I think, the sort of conventional view, and there's been a lot of quite good historical work done, in particular on Johnson's decision to escalate in '64, which is sort of the critical moment where we essentially go all in. And I think this literature is pretty convincing that they understood it was a nationalist conflict. They actually were not overly optimistic about how easy it was going to be. Johnson was not being pressed hard by domestic forces. In fact, some of his key political allies and advisors, like Richard Russell, a senator from Georgia, were opposed and told him they thought it would be a mistake. There wasn't a lot of international pressure to do it. A lot of our allies were saying it doesn't look like a very promising thing to do, and we went ahead anyway. So the situation in Vietnam is a little bit different. Iraq, I think, is basically right, and it's pretty clear that we went in without any sophisticated knowledge of what Iraqi society looked like. I think if you had known even the rudiments of Iraq's history from '58, when it had a revolution and the monarchy collapsed, to 1970, when Saddam Hussein gained power, and basically that 12-year period was a mess, right? You would have understood that once you removed Saddam, you were going to have another mess on your hands unless things were very, very fortunate. One final thing, your comment about military advice, and because it connects to what I was saying. One of the things David Petraeus did very cleverly when he was commander both in Iraq and Afghanistan was to bring outside consultants in from universities, a lot from the sort of Washington, D.C. think tank world to provide him with advice. And so they would get a trip to see what was going on and give briefings, give advice. What's interesting is the vast majority, I should add, by the way, that people like me are suckers for this kind of thing. You know, you get called up by a general to come advise them. It's very heady. I did not do this. But most of the people who did, of course, came back and became cheerleaders for how the war was going, right? Because they'd gotten a very positive spin on this, and they would write op-eds about how things were going well, we should stay the course, et cetera. And I'm convinced that this was a scheme or a clever tactical move on Petraeus' part to try and build public support for it. Just shows you again how we may not do as good a job of sort of independent accountability as necessary.
Sorry to belabor other people, but just where are the people in the foreign policy establishment or the political establishment where are the people in the political or foreign policy establishment that stand up and tell a President Johnson or stand up and tell a President George W. Bush, this is not in our national interest to send American boys and girls across the globe to fight in Asia or to Iraq to die there and split up a country? Who says that? Where is that in all these?
Not very many people. And that's what I was suggesting about sort of excessive consensus. So you have all these Democrats who, you know, were for the Iraq War before they were against it, right? And in part because they were convinced it was a good idea, part because they decided it was politically expedient to be in favor of it. It was very hard to find people in the DC think tank community at Brookings and AEI and all these places who would question this going in, because I should add one other thing just in terms of Iraq. The critical part of the decision to go into Iraq was the fact that the initial phase of the Afghan campaign went so well. Remember all the people saying we were going to get stuck in Afghanistan just like the British, just like the Russians? We oust the Taliban in a couple of months. It appears to be effortless. All the problems happened later. But it became very difficult to not see the American military as something kind of magical. It can do almost anything. And that meant that when we started to contemplate going into Iraq, it was very hard to argue this wouldn't go well, because look what had just happened in Afghanistan. And it was before, again, Afghanistan started to go south. And nobody, including those of us who opposed it, believed we couldn't defeat Saddam's army relatively easily. That was the easy part. It was what came after that many of us questioned. I should take some more. Yes, this lady right here.
Thank you for the briefing on U.S. foreign policy. So you've identified some of the incestuous nature of the foreign policy community, and you've identified how our political system most definitely places some limitations on the objectivity that might be involved. So if you were king of foreign policy, what are the action steps that you would take and over what period of time?
I'll say 2 or 3 things about that. I mean, I think it's probably obvious from what I've said is I think we have been overly willing to intervene with military force in places that don't really matter. And I kind of have a simple template for what I think makes sense in foreign policy. Does it make America safer? Does it make America richer? Or does it have a high probability of expanding or extending a set of political values that we cherish here? Democracy, human rights, whatever. And then finally, all of that is subject to a cost constraint. You have to ask yourself, what's the likelihood that this is going to be affordable or whatever? And so I tend to evaluate what we're doing in various places by that metric. I would be focusing, I mean, I agree with what Obama has done, trying to pivot more of our attention to Asia, because I think that's where the strategically significant security challenges are going to emerge over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's going to involve a shift in intellectual resources. We've spent the last 10 years building up a lot of expertise on how to chase terrorists and how to understand Islamic radicalism, and that's going to be less relevant in the future. We're going to need to build intellectual capital in various aspects of Asian politics and society. I won't go into the details, but managing alliance relations in Asia is going to be very difficult in the years ahead because many of our allies there are ambivalent about this. They like the United States. They don't want China to take over, but they're making a lot of money trading with China, and therefore they also don't want to do anything that will really irritate Beijing and might complicate that relationship. That's going to be a huge diplomatic challenge. The other part of this, if I were king of foreign policy, is I would try and get more academic institutions to get more engaged in sort of policy relevant work. The one thing I didn't talk about here was the role of academia, where much of academia has sort of gone off into political science hyperspace and just isn't all that interested in policy issues. I believe schools of public policy, to include this one, are a big exception to that. But schools of public policy also have to maintain a certain critical distance as well. We don't want to become like Washington think tanks. We don't want to be so interested in having close ties to powerful institutions that we can't have a little bit of objectivity about them as well. That's the unique thing that universities, it seems to me, can do. So if I were king of foreign policy, I would be shifting some of our priorities. I'd be much less inclined to intervene, and I would be trying to get academia to get more actively engaged in the real world of policy, as opposed to writing books and articles that are read by 3 other academics and their 4 students.
This needs to be the last question.
Okay. Okay.
The business world I come from, there are simple rules. We call it accountability, and then responsibility and accountability. How do you translate this to the word of government, and how do you translate this to the word, to actions that are made that could be drastic and catastrophic on a nation?
It's a great question, and I don't have a good answer for it. It's something I am thinking about, as I hope was clear when I was talking about accountability. I think it is a tricky problem because you can't get perfection. You do want people to be willing to take risks at times, even in the foreign policy realm. And I mean, I do think that the absence of accountability is in part a function of how well off we are, that the consequences don't appear to be that great. Just by analogy, this is what happens to militaries in peacetime, right? They end up with lots of peacetime generals who aren't particularly good at commanding. And the first year of a war, you end up firing a lot of generals because they keep losing battles. Think of Lincoln, all the effort he has to go through before he finally finds Grant. Marshall, I think, in World War II, fired 600 division commanders in the course of the war. Right? So when you get into a real serious problem, then you have to adopt practices closer to what the business world has. And we have a situation where even when we screw up in pretty massive ways, the country's basically fine. I'm overstating it. Well, that's not a world where you're going to be able to hold people very accountable unless you can instill in the system a very powerful ethic of doing that. And I'll just say that that ethic has not been much in evidence in the American political system of late.
I suggest a chapter in your new book on this subject.
I'll certainly discuss it. Whether I have an answer, I don't know yet. Thank you very much. This was lots of fun. Enjoy.